Ahead on your weekend. Giving a voice to the voiceless. This week is National Crime Victims' Rights Week. We'll take you to a local peace walk and introduce you to the families who are searching for justice and looking for an end to the violence. Plus, this weekend marks 30 years since the LA riots. We'll look back at what happened and how the city has changed since 1992.
We are overstretched. Because of the situation, there has been a bottleneck effect in Tijuana, she says. There are thousands of families waiting to claim asylum.
Sleeping in tents without access to basic services. That's how thousands of immigrants are living as they wait to be allowed to apply for asylum in the U.S. We travel to Tijuana and take you inside the shelters. Welcome to your weekend on Spectrum News 1. I'm Catalina Villegas, leading tonight's show, Crime in LA. In 2021 alone, the city of Los Angeles saw 397 killings, the most in a single year over the past 15 years. That was also a nearly 12% increase from just the year before. And with those increased rates, people are looking for answers. This week is National Crime Victims' Rights Week, honoring victims' rights and advocating for more protections and services for them. To commemorate the event and raise awareness, a peace walk took place this morning at Ted Watkins Memorial Park, and that's where we find our Ryan Blackshirt Vargas in Watts with more on the effort to make sure the voices of survivors are heard. Hey there, Ryan, what was that walk like?
Catalina, there were so many voices here at the park. There were grandmothers, mothers, aunts, uncles, of course, children, sons and daughters, all here. Yes, many voices, but with one common message: to stop violence and for justice in the community. And I spoke with one mother who just lost her son months ago, who says she wants justice for her son and for her family. A kiss on the cheek and other precious memories line the pages of her son's funeral program. It also includes a poem Karen Stevens wrote to her son, Reginald Thompson.
I love you, my son, and that shall never die. I'll see you in the morning. Love eternally, Mom.
Reginald was in a parking lot on January 11th at the corner of Vermont and Imperial talking to friends. He was 4 days away from his 34th birthday.
3 assailants came up and they just started shooting, and he never saw it coming.
His unsolved murder has taken his 2 kids away from their father and a son away from his parents.
When people take a life, they don't realize all the lives connected to that one life.
That's why she left her house and went into the streets.
Stop the murder!
And joined other crime victims in a walk for peace at Ted Watkins Park in Watts.
Stop the violence! Stop the violence! Stop the violence! Stop the violence!
The walk was organized by LaWanda Hawkins, who started Justice for Murdered Children after her son, also named Reginald, was killed. She says too many killings continue to happen.
We had too many shootings in this area. This is Southeast. We had more of the shootings, and LA was in this area and any other area. So it's very important that we take a stand in this area and demand that the violence stop in this area.
Karen said walking with other crime victims felt good. So did calling for peace.
I am his voice, and I'm speaking loud, and I'm speaking proud.
Now she can only hear his voice when she listens to his music. It's a small comfort for a mourning mom.
I hear his voice, and I see him, I feel him. It's like he's still with me, but it's painful to know he's not. And I just want him to know how proud I am of him.
Proud of the son she'll always carry in her heart. Karen, of course, joined a community of grieving mothers that she, of course, did not want to join. No mother wants to join, but she said being here was powerful to see so many in the community coming for one message: to stop violence. Catalina.
Ryan, that was actually really, really hard to watch, and it just got goosebumps, just especially listening to his voice and her reaction. I wonder, how is she trying to move her son's case forward?
Well, she is using her voice to ask for justice and ask anyone who knows anything about what happened that night, January 11th, again, this year, just months ago, to please come forward. This was on the corner, again, of Vermont and Imperial. So if anyone has any information, she urges people to contact the Sheriff's Department. Unfortunately, they don't have the case has not been solved yet. They do have some leads, but they do need more information. So she's urging people, anyone who has information, to come forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Ryan. Really appreciate it. You can now get Spectrum News 1 on the go and watch us anywhere. Just download the Spectrum News app from the App Store or Google Play. It will keep you informed with the latest hyperlocal news and up-to-the-second weather wherever you live. Plus, it will keep you connected to your community with stories and storytelling you can only get from Spectrum News 1. Check it out. This weekend, Angelenos are remembering the riots that occurred throughout Los Angeles 30 years ago. The unrest began on April 29, 1992, shortly after 4 police officers were acquitted on charges stemming from the beating of Rodney King, which was caught on camera 1 year prior. The verdict came as racial divisions had been building in LA for years, driven in part by high unemployment, police brutality, and a rise in gang violence. In particular, the 1991 killing of Latasha Harlins, a black girl who was shot by a Korean store owner, added to tensions between LA's black and Korean communities. The riots started in South LA before the chaos and destruction spread to different neighborhoods over the course of nearly a week. Today marks 30 years since the second day of the riots, which is when the Koreatown neighborhood saw the brunt of its destruction. Hundreds of homes and Korean-owned businesses in the area were damaged or destroyed, causing millions of dollars in damages. By the time riots ended on May 4th, 63 people had been killed and more than 2,000 were hurt. Ultimately, the riots caused more than $1 billion in property damage throughout the city, disproportionately affecting Koreatown. We have much more coverage coming up later this hour, including an interview with former city council member and former LA Police Chief Bernard Parks, who was on the force during the riots. Stick around for that. And then,
in fact, I was stopped once. I had a new car. Police pulled me over and asked me, where'd you get this car?
diving deeper into the unrest from 30 years ago, we'll speak to a woman who lived through the Watts uprising about how an arrest during a traffic stop sparked days of unrest back then as well. Although it's been 3 decades since the LA riots, a recent LMU poll found 68% of LA residents believe it is likely another riot or mass public disturbance will occur in the next 5 years. LA City Councilman Herb Wesson, who represents areas of South LA and Koreatown, says the results of the study make sense considering the mass protests that occurred after George Floyd was killed by a police officer in 2020. He said in part, the only way to reduce the odds of something like that occurring is for people to feel that they're given a fair shake, that everybody starts at the same starting line, and people see what is perceived to be positive changes where it related to equity and fairness. Equity and fairness is something Black communities have fought for decades, whether 2020 during the George Floyd protests, 1992 after the Rodney King verdict, and before that, 1965 with the Watts uprising. That year, Marquette Fry, a 21-year-old Black man, was violently confronted by police after being pulled over for drunk driving. The incident led to 6 days of civil unrest, 34 deaths, and $40 million in property damage. Our Dave Stolk spoke with a woman who lived through both the 1992 riots and the Watts riots of 1965. He brings us her story.
Every morning, she plays along with the contestants on her favorite game show.
I told you 700 would get it. Oh, 54.76.
Lasine Holland says she's had a long, fulfilling life.
I'm happy that I've made it to 95. I plan on making it at least to 100.
She's also lived through some terrible moments.
And I had fear seeing the flames, people losing their businesses.
But she's not speaking about the 1992 LA riots. On August 11th, 1965, Lacine, then in her late 30s, happened to be standing by on a street corner in the Watts section of South Los Angeles. She saw a white highway patrol officer kick a man named Marquette Fry, who was handcuffed and under arrest.
Quite a few people gathered.
Things quickly got out of hand. A police officer grabbed a black woman by the neck
and started dragging her.
The Watts uprising would rage for 6 days. Lacine says African Americans were reacting to years of abuse from a mostly white police force.
In fact, I was stopped once. I had a new car. Police pulled me over and asked me, where'd you get this car?
Brenda Stevenson, an expert who studies racial injustice, says she can draw a line from the Watts riots through the 1992 LA riots and ending at the 2020 civil uprising surrounding George Floyd's murder.
The notion that black people cannot receive justice in society often is the spark for civil unrest.
But Stevenson says there is now much broader support for equal justice. Lacine has done all she can do to reform criminal justice. Her son,
here he is as a motorcycle officer,
became a police officer. And then his son.
Oh, no. Might be the 9-7.
And guess what? A few years ago, Lacine actually appeared on her favorite game show. Should a police officer ever ask her why she is driving a brand new car, she can tell him she won it on The Price is Right.
Thank you so much for that story, Dave. We'll keep looking back at the LA riots 30 years later. Our coverage continues. Coming up, we'll speak with then Deputy Police Chief Bernard Parks about his perspective of the riots and his response as they broke out. As we continue our coverage of the 30-year anniversary of the LA riots, we are speaking with a person that was on the front lines during the uprising as Deputy Chief of the LA Police Department and later served as City Council member for South LA. Bernard Parks, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, the LA riots were 30 years ago. Some of our viewers weren't alive or were probably too young to remember that moment in history. Can you take us back to that day and how you felt when the verdict was read, both as an African-American man and a member of the LAPD?
You know, when I go back and think about it, first of all, the videotape that preceded this was gut-wrenching to see the amount of activity and the strikes that the officers had used on Rodney King. I was a deputy chief in what we call Central Bureau, and I had 5 stations. And so immediately I started visiting roll calls to talk to officers about the circumstances. And what kind of surprised me is how many of them verbalized that their belief that it was acceptable because the news media was refusing to tell what Rodney King had done before the contact. And I kept repeating the same thing to them, that it made no difference what he did before. What we see on television is totally unacceptable. And that's kind of how going through the several months of the filing, the investigation, the trial, that you had this division within the department where there was people who were believing that it's A-okay, and then there's those who may be quietly saying, this doesn't look good.
Now, Bernard, the relationship between police and people in the community is based on mutual trust, and it only takes turning on the TV right now to see that there's still a lot of work that we need to do. How do you improve the relationship between Angelenos and police?
Well, I think it's very simple. You have to treat people properly. During my 4 years as chief of police, We did not tolerate ill treatment of the citizens. We disciplined people. We held them accountable. We actually fired 140 officers who I felt had basically forfeited their right to be a police officer. But one of the things we found out recently, where you figure since the Christopher report, the Rodney King, the riot in 92, all these things that occurred with the consent decree and the board of inquiry that was created when I was the chief, you would think that policing was moving forward from the ills of the past. But yet we just find out that for the last 20 years, since 2002, this city has been actively involved, its police department, in stop and frisk, where they're using tactics that border on being almost illegal. In fact, the city police commission just recently published a policy and said, you no longer as an officer can make presumptive stops. You must have what we call probable cause. And that's something that's been a standard for decades, but we lost sight of that. And so we've created, although there are people who are saying crime went down during that period, we've created even more adverse relationships because we have had officers doing things under cover of the department that really were not necessarily the most proper way to manage the public.
We are at the anniversary of the LA riots 30 years ago, but just 2 years ago, we also saw unprecedented demonstrations and protests in terms of the George Floyd protests. I wonder for you, what did you feel during those protests? What was your reaction to that? And do you expect that we'll see more in the future?
I think people are finding, as someone mentioned, I was on a radio show yesterday, that riots and protests are the voices of those who have not been heard. And I think the more you keep the community at distance, the more that you did not bring them in as a partner in solving crime. It's not enough just to go into a community meeting and say, look what I've done for you. The community has to be an active partner for them to buy into what's going on. And so when you see the George Floyd incident, in the sense of the damage that was done, I don't know of many people that would logically support what was seen on television.
Former LAPD Chief and Council Member Bernard Parks, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
Do you have a story idea or a comment for us? If so, email us at lanewsdesk@charter.com, at SMAC News 1 SoCal on Twitter, and at Spectrum News 1 SoCal on Instagram and Facebook. We would love to hear from you. Fleeing violence with dreams to someday make it to the U.S. Coming up, we'll share the story of a Central American migrant stuck in Tijuana and what's keeping him from crossing the border. Hey there, I'm Catalina Villegas, and this is your Spectrum News 1 update. A Russian rocket attack destroyed an airport runway in Odessa, Ukraine's third largest city and a major Black Sea port. Russian forces have advanced on a major military operation to occupy southern and eastern Ukraine, the industrial heartland of the city. More than 5 million refugees have fled Ukraine since the war in Ukraine began. That's according to the United Nations, who also says an estimated 13 million Ukrainians are stranded near war zones and unable to leave. Ukrainian officials say 14 people have been released in a prisoner swap with Russia today. It includes 7 Ukrainian civilians and 7 Ukrainian soldiers. One of the soldiers is 5 months pregnant. As of this afternoon, the swap has not been confirmed by Russian officials.
Time now for weather on the ones. Temperatures today, the warmest of the weekend, where we're looking at middle 80s, and then we cool it down for Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Then another ridge of high pressure comes in for Wednesday. It'll stick around for a couple days, pushing 90 degrees up in Valencia. And then closer to the coast, similar to the pattern, however, just a little bit cooler. Huntington Beach, we've got mainly 60s for the next few days, and then 70s from Wednesday, Thursday, and into Friday. That is your weather on the ones.
This week, a federal judge paused President Biden's efforts to lift Title 42, a rule that for years has prohibited migrants from applying for asylum. Title 42 is a rule put in place at the beginning of the pandemic to try to keep COVID cases low. The Biden administration was set to lift Title 42 on May 23rd, but Republican-led states are suing, hoping to keep the order in place. This week, I traveled to Tijuana and visited a migrant shelter there to see what kind of impact this rule is having on people. Here's my story from the border.
These clothes are the last ties 34-year-old Heidi has to her life back in Guadalajara. Her daughter is helping her hang them at an abandoned shopping center in Tijuana, where they have been living along with her 6 other children for half a year. It's really stressful. Sometimes I don't even know where I get the energy to get out of bed. Tired of broken windows and bones at the hands of her husband, Heidi left Guadalajara and took her 7 children with her, knowing the only place he couldn't reach them would be the U.S. But when she got to the border, she was told that because of COVID, they weren't accepting asylum applications, a rule called Title 42. So for months, she has been sleeping in this tent with her children, living next to dozens of other migrant families, all waiting for Title 42 to end. I feel sad, she says, desperate. A lot of things go through my mind. Sometimes I feel like life isn't worth living. Like it'll be better if I'm dead, she says, because nothing is going to change. Everything will stay the same. Since it was implemented at the start of the pandemic, migrants have been expelled more than 1.8 million times under Title 42, according to Customs and Border Protection. When they're expelled, they wait in border cities like Tijuana. These tents are set up on the doorsteps of the Borderline Crisis Center. Judith Cabrera de la Rocha is the co-director. She says they used to shelter migrants in emergency situations for a night or two, but Title 42 has changed everything. We are overstretched. Because of the situation, there has been a bottleneck effect in Tijuana, she says. There are thousands of families waiting to claim asylum. There aren't enough shelters in the city, and of the shelters that do exist, there isn't enough space. The average length of stay at this shelter is now 6 months, so they've started to address longer-term needs, like schooling and infrastructure. This place isn't suitable for residents. We don't have the infrastructure to shelter all of these people. So, for example, there are grease stains on the wall that could present a fire danger, but we haven't been able to create a proper and dignified kitchen for these people. But for migrants like Heidi, looking back isn't an option. Sometimes I spend hours out here looking at the border, she says, because I know someday God will help me make it to the other side. And so, despite everything, somehow, hope in this abandoned mall is still alive.
Now, along with Title 42 tonight, we're talking about another Trump-era border policy called Migrant Protection Protocols, or the Remain in Mexico program. The policy forces migrants to wait in Mexico as their cases make their way through the system, even if they have no ties to Mexico. President Biden suspended Remain in Mexico on his first day in office, but a judge reinstated it back in December. And this week, it was before the Supreme Court. While at the border, we spoke with migrants under this other different policy and saw how it's shaping their lives.
Inside a Salvation Army migrant shelter in Tijuana, a Central American migrant we'll call Juan is giving us a tour. He's been here since February. That's when his plan to pursue the American dream for his wife and 4 girls turned into a living nightmare. Turns out the American dream is expensive. So expensive that sometimes it will cost you your life, says Juan, who in his journey to the U.S. witnessed the murder of an entire family. He thought that would all be over once he crossed the border and told Border Patrol his story.
Nosotros sentimos que como que ellos fueran un ángel para nosotros.
We thought they were our angels. We felt safe in their hands. But despite telling them our stories, we were expelled into Tijuana, back into the mouth of the dragon. Juan is one of 3,000 migrants in a Trump-era program called Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico policy. It forces him to wait in Mexico while his asylum case makes its way through the courts. Juan asks me, what kind of program named after protecting migrants puts them in danger?
Cada cabeza nuestra tiene un precio.
There is a price on each of our heads. It's about $8,000 per kidnapped migrant. Through February of last year, there were more than 1,500 documented cases of rape, kidnapping, and assault of MPP migrants like Juan, according to Human Rights First. It happens so often that Juan created a hand-me-down program.
Si en 3 días no regresan.
In 3 days, we'll know if they successfully passed or not. And if they got through, then what they left behind, we give to the next migrant who comes that was robbed. But not even these stories, he says, have been enough to convince immigration authorities of the dangers migrants face. His only real shot is a U.S. lawyer.
Aquí se les llama a los abogados.
We call lawyers and they don't pick up. And the ones that do, they charge us $7,000 for the case. While the Biden administration stopped the MPP program on Inauguration Day, a judge reinstated it last December. And so ever since, these beds have been filling up with migrant after migrant, forced to wait like Juan on this side of the fence.
Yo salí con el corazón destrozado.
My heart is in tatters, he says.
Pero, por desgracia, pues se nos ha hecho difícil.
And unfortunately, it's been hard. It's out of my hands, and there is no help.
Ayuda, no tenemos ayuda.
Whether you survive the journey or you get through into the U.S., one thing he has learned, Juan says, is that the American dream is all about luck. And as another day comes to an end in Tijuana, he hopes tomorrow will be the dawn of a better fate.
We're continuing our coverage on immigration, specifically talking about Title 42 and other issues affecting our southern border. Joining us now to help break things down is Congressman Tony Cardenas from the 29th District, representing the North Central San Fernando Valley. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us on this Saturday.
Thank you for having me, Catalina, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Congressman, we know that you and the rest of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus met with President Biden earlier this week to speak about immigration as well as other topics. What did you hear from the president that you liked, and where did he fall short?
Well, what I liked about the president, he was very positive, and he was engaging with us, and we had dialogue going back and forth, giving each other opinions about what we need to see going forward when it comes to Title 42, when it comes to student loans, things of that nature. And we walked out of there very, very pleased. President Biden is a president we can trust. When he gives his word, he's going to do everything that he can to complete it.
Now, as you know, Title 42 was put in place as a public health measure meant to cut down the number of COVID infections. It's worth noting that there is not the same concern when it comes to tourists. Tourists can come and go freely, or migrants can fly into the country and they don't face the same restrictions as they do with Title 42. But now some proponents of Title 42 argue that we need to keep it in place as a tool to prevent excess immigration. Does it make sense to keep Title 42 in place for either health or immigration reasons?
Title 42 needs to end right away. And President Biden has already promised, he confirmed with the Hispanic Caucus members who met with him just last week, myself and others, is that he promised to do it by May 23rd. They're doing everything that they can to rebuild the system that former President Donald Trump dismantled. And so they're trying to rebuild the system so that when they get rid of Title 42, we're going to be treating human beings like they should be treated like human beings and giving them a dignified due process for them to follow.
Now, obviously, none of this is happening in a vacuum. We have midterm elections coming up in less than 5 months. Are Democrats willing to lose seats to get rid of Title 42? And if so, what kind of long-term impact will that have on immigration?
I think when you do the right thing, it's not about losing seats. When you do the right thing, it's about keeping true to yourself and keeping true to the voters. And I think when we do the right thing, people do see what we're doing, especially when it comes to compassion, especially when it comes to focusing on the economy, focusing on people who are seeking asylum, people who are fearing for their lives, fleeing for their lives. It's not just people in Ukraine who are fleeing for their lives. There's people from Africa. There's people from South America. And trust me when I say this, the United States of America is still the #1 economy in the world. But right now we're slipping a little bit because we don't have the right size of folks ready and willing to work and fill those jobs that are empty right now. And when I say that immigrants are some of the hardest working people in the world, when they come to the United States of America, they give to our economy. They make our industries work well. For example, when it comes to agriculture, when it comes to technology, when it comes to transportation, transporting things, everything you could think of, the hotel industry. If you look over your left shoulder, your right shoulder, you look in front of you, you're probably going to find people who were born in this country, but also people who came to this country and are so grateful and are working really hard to keep us the #1 economy in the world.
Congressman Tony Cardenas from the 29th District. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Catalina. I look forward to talking to you soon.
30 years on, in this intersection and every intersection, and with every intersection, we have the opportunity to be prophets of peace and to be makers of this great city.
Local leaders and family members of Rodney King calling for peace 30 years after the LA riots will bring you their message to the people of LA right after this. Local leaders gathered yesterday to commemorate the anniversary of the 1992 uprising. LA Mayor Eric Garcetti, along with mayoral hopeful former Representative Karen Bass, joined the family members of Rodney King and Latasha Harlins, along with Black and Korean American community members, urging unity among all Angelenos.
We must treat the trauma in order to move past it. 30 years on, in this intersection and every intersection, and with every intersection, we have the opportunity to be prophets of peace and to be makers of this great city.
I am hopeful because this is Los Angeles. We have all of the knowledge, the skills, and the resources here to continue to move our city forward in a positive direction. And we have to make sure that we never allow anybody to divide us.
The group gathered at the intersection of Florence and Normandy Avenues, which was the epicenter of the unrest, after the jury acquitted the 4 LAPD officers charged with using excessive force in the beating of Rodney King. Tensions and trauma are still fresh in the minds of many in our community. Timothy Parker spoke with one man who made sure the world saw what happened 30 years ago, and he wants to show us how we can still learn from it.
In this neighborhood, Tom's Market is the place to go when you need a drink, adult or otherwise. It's one of the rare businesses which still remains 30 years after the riots in South Los Angeles, following the verdict in the Rodney King beating case.
I stood on top of that car recording.
Timothy Goldman was here then, documenting the chaos on April 29th, 1992, capturing it all on his camcorder, expecting a full police presence. But he says law enforcement let it get out of hand.
One of the reasons why I kept recording after the police evacuated, I kept recording because I knew they were going to, go back and regroup and come back in riot gear and clear this intersection out. But they never came back. I said, oh, they're just going to let it burn.
And even as far down as Compton, as Korean American Carol Park can tell you, she was 12 years old, fearful for her mom's life, who was trapped inside of their family-owned gas station during the riots.
They've got bottles, rocks, they've got, bats, whatever, all kinds of stuff. And she's like, I don't think I can leave. And I says, did you call the police? And she said, yeah, but, they're not answering and they're not coming.
Today, Park is going for her PhD at UC Riverside, where she also has taught Korean American studies. Through her research, she says their community made up 40% of the financial business lost in the riots. Even though things were tense between her community and the African American community, she's not placing blame.
It's not because of inter-ethnic strife that civil unrests happen. It's the macro issues, these issues at large, police brutality, the socioeconomic disparities, right? That gap again between the haves and the have-nots.
Back in South LA, Timothy says this neighborhood is safer 30 years later, but the distrust of police still remains.
It's kind of hard after you've been treated and mistreated all those years, all of a sudden say, hey, you're my buddy now.
These days, his camera is down, but he still has a second home near this intersection where he was an eyewitness to history.
Thank you so much for that, Timothy. And as we learned from the events of the past, many are looking to the future and to help revitalize underserved communities. In South LA, the Dodgers Foundation unveiled their 58th Dodgers Dream Field at Maywood Park this afternoon. Upgrades to the park included a brand new LED scoreboard, new playing surfaces and grass, and a new training zone for youth baseball and softball players. And speaking of the Dodgers, the Boys in Blue took home a 5-1 win over the Detroit Tigers last night. The team is now 7-1 at Dodger Stadium. Sportsnet's LA John Hartung and Nomar Garcia Parra have their one takeaway.
Stay on top of every Dodgers game all season long with One Takeaway. Presented by Morongo Casino Resort and Spa. Good times.
Hi, everyone. I'm John Hartung. The Dodgers beat the Detroit Tigers Friday night. I'm joined now by Nomar Garcia Parra. Our one takeaways, it was a night of first home runs for a couple Dodgers. Bottom of the first, Justin Turner at the plate. 0 homers on the season, Nomar, but he changes it quickly.
Does a great job getting on top of this ball, driving it out to left field. Adrian Gonzalez was saying JT is going deep today, and he was right.
And Chris Taylor comes to the plate in the second inning after this home run by JT. And you mentioned Adrian Gonzalez calling his shot. Nomar, you called your shot. You said CT was going deep for the first time.
I was thinking about it the other night. I was going, he's going to get one here really soon. He's swinging the bat well, and there it was. Stays back on a breaking ball, and he crushes this ball out there in the concourse.
The Dodgers on top early here in the 7th inning. Look at the play by Cody Bellinger in center.
You don't always have to drive runs in to help your team. You can save some runs as well. He was flashing the glove.
Dodgers win 5-1 on Friday nights. It'll be Clayton Kershaw getting the start on Saturday at 7 p.m. on Sportsnet LA. We hope to see you then.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. And that's going to do it for this edition of Your Weekend on Spectrum News 1. I'm Catalina Villegas. If you have a comment for me or you just want to say hello, you can reach me on social media. My handle is right here on your screen. We're going to leave you with a look out at Newport Beach. And we'll see you back here next Saturday at 5. It's a date.